Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm absolutely delighted, truthfully, to have Brenda Davis with us. Brenda is a registered dietitian of really international acclaim. She's been sought by a number of governments and cultures for her, nutritional consultation work. She's been a lead investigator on a diabetic intervention program in the Marshall Islands. She's been involved with setting up a lifestyle intervention in Lithuania. She's an incredible author of over at least a dozen books that I know of: Becoming Vegan, Kick Diabetic Cookbook, and of course, one we're going to talk about today, her most recent book, Plant-Powered Protein. And Brenda, I'm just excited to have you. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world, championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Well, I'm really excited to get to have a visit with you as well, Frank. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, when I look at, your prolific writing, you've sold several million books and they've been translated in 13 languages. It must be really rewarding to know the lives that you've been able to touch with your work. I know that's nothing anybody can ever anticipate. So when that happens, it must fill you with a certain kind of awe and gratitude, truthfully.
Oh, I just feel so privileged. I'm so grateful for every life I have a chance to touch in a positive way. And I just feel so privileged. It really is such an honor to be able to have had done those things in my life and to been able to travel and help people in faraway countries as well. What an honor and privilege. So
well, when I look at your magical journey, really truthfully, and the background that you have, going back to an interview I read a few years back about you, I want to get an idea, and I think the audience will find it interesting, how the little girl growing up in Germany with a love for Wiener Schnitzel found her way into the path that you are. And really, when did your interest in nutrition start? And I know you already had a bit of a professional life before you embraced the vegan lifestyle. So talk about that journey just a little bit, if you can.
Well, I think like a lot of children, I was born with a certain compassion for animals, and I think as a lot of us are as small children. And I can remember when I was about, I think, 3 years old, I was at a bullfight in Spain. And I can still remember being so horrified by what they were doing. And I remember my parents being very concerned when I started cheering for the bull. People around us were not impressed. So I think it was just always there. And then somehow, as we grow up, we get desensitized to all of this as we're eating meat and so forth. And then in high school, it's when it's really when it all came back. I can remember being about 16 years old and sitting on a rock by a lake thinking, what do I want my life to be about? And by that age, I was already drinking alcohol every weekend with my friends and doing all those things. And I thought to myself, I don't know what my life is to be all about, but I know this. I want to live a meaningful life, and I want to make a difference in the world. I want to make the world a more compassionate place. And I started thinking about that and thinking that why am I doing what I'm doing with drinking alcohol and so forth? I thought, I can't afford to be addicted to anything. And I remember stopping cold. I thought, I will never do drugs. I will not I've never even had a cup of coffee. I just thought I don't want to be addicted to anything that could get in the way of doing what I'm meant to do in this world. And so that was sort of the beginning of it. And it was very shortly after that I started getting really interested in all things vegetarian, and just because of the compassion piece. And I can remember when I went to university, I decided nutrition was what I wanted to do. I was really interested in human nutrition. And I thought, I'll go to university, I'll learn everything I can. And I had this passion for vegetarian, but it got, it got really challenged in university, because what we learned in university was that plant-based diets or vegetarian diets are risky and vegan diets are just downright dangerous. And that's pretty much all we learned in university about plant-based nutrition. And then I went on and became a public health nutritionist, and all of my nutrition education tools were literally, steeped in animal products. So Canada's food guide at that time was half, it was a plate that was half animal foods and half plant foods. And that was, the basis for nutrition education for public health. And it wasn't until about 1989 that I was just really challenged by a very good friend who was on his way deer hunting. He was actually the best man at our wedding. We grew up, my husband and I, in Northern Ontario, and it was, beer and bingo and hunting and fishing. That was what was done there. And I really wanted to make him feel guilty about killing another deer. And so I challenged him about, shooting and going with this big gun and shooting this innocent, beautiful creature. And it was what he replied to me that actually really changed the course of my life. Because he said, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger does not mean you are not responsible for the trigger being pulled every time you buy a piece of meat camouflaged in cellophane in the grocery store. And then he said, at least the animals I eat have had a life. He said, I doubt very much you can say the same for the ones that are sitting on your plate.
So that was an aha moment really for
It
you.
was an aha moment, because it was the first time anybody said you're responsible for what you're eating and your choices. You're the one paying the dollar to have somebody do this for you. And at that point, I just thought to myself, I need to learn about where my food is coming from. And it was at that point I just started to order journals and articles and read books. And it took me about 2 weeks to decide that I couldn't be part of this system of cruelty any longer. I just thought, I cannot in good conscience be part of a system that, literally puts animals in concentration camps, tortures them for their whole lives, and then we, send them to a slaughterhouse and we eat them. And I thought, not only is this unnecessary, but we're actually harming ourselves. We're harming the planet. It just is all bad, And I thought, in this web of life, our choices matter. And I thought, I've got to make different choices. And so at that time, my kids were 4 and 1. This is 1989. And I had to ask my husband if he would be willing to do this with me, if we could do it as a family. And I remember going to him and saying, I really want to be completely vegetarian, which was vegan, which we barely knew that word at that time. And I said, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to do this with me. And he responded saying something that I didn't expect to hear. He said, I thought you'd never ask. He said, I'd love to be a vegetarian.
You found the right guy, didn't you? You found the right guy for sure.
I sure did, because in that, community where we were, neither one of us had ever really met real live vegetarians. I think I met one in grade 8. That was it. It just wasn't a thing. And so I was actually really afraid. I thought I was going to be ousted from my profession.
That was the next question I wanted to ask you, because your mindset took a very quick turn. Your learning curve of a couple of weeks is very short, but I'm very curious because you were working in public health, how the professional transition went for you. So speak to that just a little bit. That must
Yeah,
have been difficult,
exactly. I was terrified because I was a public health nutritionist.
right?
I taught Canada's food guide. I did all of that. And I went through this sort of personal questioning of, can I stay in this profession as a person who's eating an entirely plant-based diet? And I went through a lot. I thought, well, what else would I do? Would I get re-educated? And then I thought, if everybody who sees the bigger picture just decides to leave, what will ever change? I have to have the courage to stand up for what I know is right. And I could be a leader in this way to help people who want to do this get it right. And so I thought, I need to have all my I's dotted, my T's crossed. I need to know my stuff. And so I just started reading everything I could read on plant-based diets. I read, I can remember the 1990 Diet, Nutrition, and the Prevention of Chronic Disease by the World Health Organization. What a powerful document that was. And reading all of these sort of more big picture documents really helped to give me the confidence I needed to move forward. And then it was within a year of us becoming plant-based, we actually moved to Vancouver and we met other real live vegetarians. And so it was fun. And I actually met two vegetarian dietitians. And I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. It was just so wonderful to know that there were others out there. And of course, I started reading Vegetarian Times and I learned about John Robbins and Michael Clapper and George Eisman and Ginny Messina and, all of these people who were there before me and had started before me. And I was so grateful for them. And they made me feel like, yes, this is something you can do. And it wasn't always easy. I mean, the first book I wrote with Vasanto Molina and Victoria Harrison and three registered dietitians, wrote a book called Becoming Vegetarian. And of course, the dairy industry thought it would be all good. We'd be promoting a lot of dairy products, but it was actually a vegan book in disguise. So we had chapters called Without Meat and Without Dairy. So how do you meet your nutritional requirements when you eliminate these things? And the dairy industry took quite exception to us writing about that it's possible to survive without dairy when it was one of the essential food groups without which you would die. And so they actually wrote a 45-page rebuttal to our book. And they took out a full-page ad in our professional journal to try to discredit our work. So we definitely had some battles. But generally, I was surprised at how fellow dietitians came to our rescue, and they were very much on our side and felt that we had done an exceptional job. They were grateful for the book. They were grateful for a resource that they could rely on. And we started getting invited to speak at, the American Dietetic Association, Canadian Dietetic Association. I think I've spoken at dietetic associations in close to 20 countries. So it really was better received than what I expected, to be quite honest.
I'm here with Brenda Davis, a registered dietitian of international acclaim. We're going to take just a short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back to the Health Science Podcast. You're listening to the Health Science Podcast Show. I want to remind you to visit the National Health Association website, where you'll find incredible resources to support your healthy lifestyle, including plant-exclusive eating without added salt, oil, and sugar. Simply go to healthscience.org or nationalhealthassociation.org. Be sure to check out membership, which is only $35 per year for those living within the United States and $55 for those living outside the U.S. You'll be amazed at all the information and benefits you'll receive. As a member, you're kept up to date on the latest evidence-based tools for health promotion. You'll receive the incomparable quarterly magazine, Health Science, a beautiful 40-page advertising-free publication mailed to your home or offices, loaded with articles, recipes, inspirational stories, and interviews with world leaders in the fields of personal health, plant-based nutrition, water-only fasting, animal rights, and environmental support. And you'll receive details about life-changing events, such as the extraordinary annual conference of the National Health Association and diverse opportunities for plant-exclusive NHA cruises and travel vacations to exotic destinations around the globe. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now back to the show. Brenda, and I want to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty, because what happens here, as you know, a lot of times nutrition is approached by many people and even so-called experts from what I like to call a very deceptive level of simplicity, meaning that, you know, we look at nutrition, we look at macronutrients, and of course, protein's the holy grail and fat is the villain of the story. And so what happens is, as we vilify nutrients that actually have tremendous value, and as we beatify other components of nutrition that have their own problems in excess, I think sometimes we lose sight of the balance that's really required in how we view these components. So with the new book you put out, which is absolutely brilliant, Plant-Powered Protein, let's speak to that deceptive level of simplicity and see if we can come to a way to balance the viewpoint of the audience just a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, it's so funny because when we were asked to write a book on protein, we were asked by our publisher, and Vasanto and I both said, we don't need a book on protein. People that eat, you know, whole food plant-based diets, they'll get enough protein. And our publisher said, well, it's the number one question I get asked from everybody who comes to buy a book is, oh, well, you know, if I eat this way, where am I going to get my protein?
It's the number one question going back 45 years in my clinical experience. For every talk we've ever done, the hand goes up, where do you get your protein? So
Exactly.
so in a way, as much as you think it's not necessary, it is necessary. So yeah, so go on. Yeah, sorry.
Exactly. So we really thought about it, and we thought, you know what? Let's try to put this question to rest, and let's look at everything we look at. And we actually learned a lot doing this book. Let's address all of the issues around protein, including the environmental piece, including some of the history of why protein sits on this health pedestal, or has a bit of a health halo, if you will. And we looked at all of that, and it was really quite interesting. And actually, we brought in another person into this authorship, my son, Corey Davis, who did his undergraduate studies in environmental sciences, and then went on to do a couple of master's degrees and became a professional agrologist. But he has some very interesting insights into the whole area of sourcing protein from plants versus animals and so forth. And I think it added an awful lot to the book. So that's there as well. But yeah, you know, we all know that it's this beautiful symphony of nutrients from whole foods that really does the job in terms of promoting and ensuring long-term health. But it's still interesting to look at some of the individual macro and micronutrients and you know, how this all works within the symphony.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I like the fact that you also address the fact that there are certain stages of life where those needs actually change and need to be addressed, sometimes with a little bit more in certain times of older age, and, you know, growing children and pregnant women and lactating women. And I think getting into the nuances of that is a good insight for people, because it's not one taste for all. You need to be able to, I was looking at data that suggested when you have men and women consuming around 90 grams of protein, there's a remarkable drop in sarcopenia for people that are not even routinely doing a ton of exercise. So that loss of muscle mass can be preserved by, increasing some of that, and then realizing the protein density of all the plants, greens, and vegetables, which oftentimes goes unnoticed by people. They just can't fathom this idea that green plants can have, substantial amounts of high quality protein. And in fact, they do. So presenting all of that, I thought was, a brilliant thing that people need to be reminded of if they knew it, and certainly educated in if they did not know it.
Yes, and I think it's so interesting. As we age, our ability to really digest and absorb protein and the individual amino acids declines. And so what's really challenging for seniors is that generally our energy requirements drop, and yet our protein requirements and requirements for some other nutrients as well, because our ability to absorb them is reduced, grows. And so here we are trying to get all of these nutrients with fewer calories. So yes, we know athletes need higher amounts of protein, but they eat so many calories, it's pretty easy to do.
Right.
Whereas seniors eating fewer calories, it can be a little more challenging. They may have to focus a little more on some of the more concentrated protein plant sources, like the legume family, for example. And when we think about the amount of protein in plants, like you talked about greens, but it's so interesting. What humans require is probably about 10 to 15% of calories from protein, which is what people in the blue zones actually consume.
Right.
And those are very reasonable protein intakes. And if people eat a mix or a variety of whole plant foods, that's exactly where we fall, in that 10 to 15% range. And what a lot of people don't realize is that, the only foods that don't have any protein are oils and sugars, really.
Right.
All whole plant foods contain protein. Now, fruit is a little lower. It's somewhere 1 to 10% of calories. Some of the starchy vegetables are a little lower, maybe 8 to 12% of calories. But generally, most of the other foods are above the 10%. So if you look at legumes, they're about 20 to 40% of calories from protein. Most of the non-starchy vegetables are in that range as well. There are some that are a little lower than 20%, but a lot are between that 20 to 40%. And then if we look at nuts and seeds, well, seeds are around 11 to 22. Nuts are around, some are a little lower, but generally around the 8 to 15 or so. And so if you're eating a variety of these whole plant foods, you're really taking in a pretty decent amount of protein.
Yeah.
And where people go wrong, there are a couple of instances we see where people don't get enough protein. And that can happen when people, and especially we see this in young people, say teenagers, who just all of a sudden get what we're doing to animals and do not want to consume animal products anymore. But they don't know a lot about nutrition. So they, instead of ordering the burger and fries and Coke, they order the fries and Coke.
Right.
And just, they're eating a really highly processed junk food diet that really doesn't have a lot of good sources of protein. Most of us didn't grow up learning to eat beans and lentils. And so when you take out the meat, they're not sure how to put together a well-balanced plant-based diet. And sometimes fruitarians can be a little bit low in protein as well, if they're eating almost completely fruit and not adding the seeds and greens and so forth. And then the other people we see fall short are the seniors that are kind of tea and toast seniors,
Right.
that just really aren't eating a balanced diet either. So those are some of the more common.
That statement about diversity is so important, because even with kids and teenagers, as you know, they'll get into, like, they'll eat peanut butter, they like it, and they may just eat peanut butter all the time. So what'll happen is they'll focus on like almost a mono type diet. And of course, they're going to create all kinds of breakdown. And the bottom line is, we always emphasize eating a diversity of all these whole plant foods. And as you made the point, that's going to bring in the wide range of nutrients that we in fact need. The other place where that got problematic is that, and you see this polarization even in vegan circles, that when People like Ornish and Esselstyn did these profound experiments, reversing heart disease by lowering fat content. It almost created a vilification of fat, even in the vegan community. So people started being afraid to even eat nuts and seeds and avocados and foods that have whole food fat that has tremendous value in the body. And I'm still seeing these arguments raging today, and it's a big mistake. Why don't you speak to that just a little bit too? Because I know there's such a misunderstanding about the benefits of eating good quality fat in whole foods.
Absolutely. And I think one of the points that a lot of people say, well, these are the studies that showed us we could reverse a coronary artery disease, and it's the number one killer. So of course, these have to be the gold standard for everyone. But the reality is, though, we don't have a study that has compared a sort of a under 10% of calories from fat, no added nuts and seeds, no avocados, etc., to a similar diet that includes those foods. And in my view, we may be surprised at the results, because when you think about the higher fat whole plant foods like nuts and seeds and avocados, these foods are very nutrient dense foods. They provide a lot of especially trace minerals and vitamins that are more concentrated in them than they are in many other foods, like the selenium in Brazil nuts, and some of these minerals that aren't so easy to get enough of. But they also help us to absorb fat soluble nutrients. So there are many nutrients that are fat soluble. There are many phytochemicals and antioxidants that are fat soluble. And so consuming some higher levels of fat with our meal will help us to maximize the absorption of the very components in the diet that are most protective. And when we eliminate those foods, we can actually compromise absorption of nutrients that are critical to health. And so to me, for healthy individuals, and even for individuals with chronic diseases, we want to include at least a reasonable level of higher fat plant foods, so that we maximize the absorption of these very protective nutrients and our intake of a wide variety of nutrients. And fats are so critical to health. Fats are critical to hormone production. They are responsible for the production of many different compounds, different eicosanoids and resolvins and protectants that help to really boost immunity, control pretty much every body system that we have. They're a part of our cell membranes. They affect the shape, the permeability, the cell-to-cell communication. They affect all of that. And so it makes sense that they're really a critical part of the diet. And so I think, an argument can be made about, minimizing concentrated fats and oils, but I really think there's a very good argument to be made for including these wonderful higher fat whole plant foods.
Yeah, no question. Brenda, where can people follow you? Where can they find you online to get more information about you and from you?
Yes, so I have a website, brendadavisrd.com. My email address is brendadavis@telus.net, TELUS. We have a website for our latest book, Plant Powered Protein, and that's plant-poweredprotein.com. And so I love to hear from people, and welcome to be in touch.
Brenda, we always talk about, and you've mentioned it already, and most of us have been teaching this for a long time, about nutrients from whole foods, and we know the benefit of that. Colin Campbell wrote a beautiful book called Whole, where he emphasizes the fact that when we're eating whole foods, not only are we taking so many nutrients we know of, but many things we haven't even discovered yet. And they work in synergies and orchestrations that we can't even fathom at the level of intelligence that we have. But we do know that there are things that can at times be isolated nutrient changes and deficiencies. And I know those have been talked about and bandied about. And one that you have spoken about that I'd like to touch on, because it comes up a lot, is the really global deficiency of iodine. Let's just touch on that a little bit, because that is one of those unheralded minerals and things that people kind of dance around, and yet we know how important it is for the growth of the nervous system and skeletal structures in infants and children. We know how important it is for thyroid hormone production. So when we're looking at this whole vegan diet, this whole food, plant food diet, we know that it's present in seaweeds. We know that it can be present in things like iodized salt, but we're also teaching a diet that is pretty salt-free. So how do you recommend, how do you interact with people to address that very profound mineral in their diets?
Yes, and I think that it's just really important that people understand that iodine deficiency is the number one cause of cognitive impairment in infants globally. Even a minor deficiency or what I would say insufficient intakes can cause a loss of 10 to 15 IQ points in a baby. So people really do need to recognize that this is an essential nutrient. We must have it in our diet. And if you look around the world, the amount of iodine in the soil in different areas varies tremendously. And there are some parts of the world where iodine deficiency is very common because iodine in soil is so low. And so your risk of deficiency will depend on where you live. But generally, what we did globally to try to prevent these sort of tragic tales of severe cognitive impairment in babies was to add iodine to salt. And so for people that are trying to eat a really whole foods diet and minimize their intake of salt, and even people who are just trying to eat a cleaner diet and use some of these, these sea salts or Himalayan sea salt or whatever the case may be, these salts are not iodized. And so for both of those groups, those using non-iodized salts and those using diets that are really SOS or free of salt or added salt, they need to think about where their iodine is coming from. And so,
yeah, in your professional opinion, if someone was eating a diversity of plants from many different soil conditions, let's suppose in a country like the United States or Canada, do you believe they could satisfy that iodine without any supplementation?
I think it's possible, but I think it is also something that I would consider supplementing to be on the safe side, especially if you're at childbearing age and thinking of having children. You just want to make sure that your iodine status is taken care of. So what I would add is you can easily add a little bit of seaweed. Now, seaweed is tricky because, again, seaweed can contain contaminants. Seaweed can be extremely concentrated in iodine. So, for example, about 1/16 of a teaspoon of kelp will satisfy, your daily need for iodine, about 150 micrograms a day for a non-pregnant, non-lactating adult. During pregnancy and lactation, you need more. And so, it's a very small amount. So a young child who needs 90 micrograms a day, their upper limit is 200 micrograms. So, consuming a quarter of a teaspoon or an eighth of a teaspoon would exceed their upper limit. So we just need to be aware of the concentration of iodine in these foods. Nori is not a concern because the amount of iodine in a big sheet of nori may be close to 70 to 100 micrograms. So it's not generally going to exceed the upper limit. But other seaweeds such as kelp and even dulse and some of those seaweeds are definitely more concentrated. So it's just good to know how much is there and how to add it safely to the diet. There are some little, containers of sprinkles,
Right.
and using it that way is a really good idea because it's just a sprinkle on food. And generally that'll boost your iodine status enough. Some people may want to just use an iodine supplement, or if you're using a high quality multi that is a whole food multi that has some iodine, that that could solve the problem as well. But I do think it's something that we do need to be aware of, and just to think about where it's
Yeah,
coming from.
and as you mentioned, some of those seaweeds can have contaminants, like hijiki usually has some arsenic contamination and things of this nature. So your point is well made. You know what I wanted
Yes, and I want to add, Frank, that basically there are a number of countries, including Canada and I think Hong Kong, and there are a number of countries that advise against the use of hijiki because of the levels of contaminants. So if you use hijiki at all, it should just be on occasion in moderation. That's definitely not one seaweed to rely on as your source of iodine.
Well, the nice thing is you do have dulse flakes and shakers that can provide just little sprinkles, which will work beautifully if people put it on salads. You can put it on steamed vegetables. You can put it on casseroles. So that's a kind of a nice methodology for people on a more routine basis if they don't want to eat the iodized salt, so to speak. You know
Yes,
what? I
exactly.
wanted to touch base on your work culturally. What came out, and what is some of the significant things that came out of your work, let's say in the Marshall Islands? I know you were in that diabetic intervention program. Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, so
The ups and downs of that experience for you.
yes, well, the Marshall Islands, for people that aren't aware, are sort of halfway between Hawaii and Australia. And it's a population of about 60,000 people. There are about, 1,200 islands that are part of the Marshall Islands, but the vast majority of the population, probably about 45,000, are on two of those islands. And it's a very tropical climate. And 100 years ago, diabetes was pretty much unheard of there. People lived off the land. They, ate fish and plants, and that was pretty close to it. Today, the population has grown so much on these islands that the islands don't produce enough food to sustain the population. So they import food, and they don't have a lot of money. There's not a lot of work. So they import the cheapest, highly processed foods that they can import. And that's, really what people eat. And so, a typical meal will be white, sticky rice with a very high glycemic index, and Spam or barbecued chicken or grilled chicken, or turkey tails, or some sort of inexpensive meat, or fish. But fish, they, often don't eat as much of as these other animal products. And they drink a lot of sweet drinks, and the children love ramen noodles, and their favorite way of having them is with Kool-Aid powder sprinkled on top. So it's really, the diet is so processed today that the people of the Marshall Islands have among the highest rates of diabetes in the world, type 2 diabetes, of course. And so we went into the Marshall Islands with this lifestyle intervention trial, which was a clinical trial with 5 overlapping cohorts. And we had control groups receiving usual care, and intervention groups receiving really quite an intensive lifestyle medicine intervention, which included a plant-based diet, exercise, stress management, all of the pillars of lifestyle medicine. And I have to tell you that I developed the sort of designed the program, created the materials for educating the people, and which I learned very quickly were way too high level for a lot of the people and had to be toned down. And we developed the recipes, and I learned very quickly people really don't do recipes per se. They don't know what a tablespoon or a cup is in terms of measuring utensils. So it was all quite challenging. It was very interesting, and it was a beautiful group of people. I've never experienced. I'll just tell you a story to give you a flavor of these people. We had a doctor come to assist with some of our interventions, and there are 2 roads to walk back to our hotel. Well, there are only 2 roads on the island, and one is going right by the water by a bunch of homes, and they come alive at night because during the day it's quite hot. and he came from New York, and he was walking back to the hotel, and it was close to midnight. And a group of teenage boys was coming towards him, and he got very nervous because in New York at midnight, if a group of teenage boys is coming towards you, you might get a little concerned. And he said as they were getting closer, he saw that they had their arms around one another. And then he heard that they were all singing. And as they approached him, they became very friendly with him and said Yahweh, Yahweh, which is love and hi and all of those wonderful things. And they just continued singing. And he said, I immediately realized I was in a very different place. And the thing that I loved about the people is they laughed and sang and never even gave a second thought of singing in public. It was just what they did. It was absolutely beautiful. And I fell in love with the Marshallese people. But I have to tell you that I was stunned at how quickly their bodies started to heal once they started the program. I couldn't believe people who said they had been in pain for 20 years and the pain disappeared in a week. People said their brain had felt fuzzy for years, and all of a sudden they were thinking clearly. They complained that they only, some of them were going to the bathroom once a week. We had one person that it was 13 days since his last bowel movement, and all of a sudden they're going to the bathroom every day, and their blood glucose levels dropped, on average in the first 2 weeks, 75 milligrams per deciliter. It was just remarkable to see these changes. And most of the people in the Marshall Islands didn't believe that diet would do anything. They just thought diabetes was just the luck of the draw. And they were shocked to see the changes in their health and the weight loss and how much better they felt and how much easier they could move. And the other thing that we found so valuable beside the plant-based diet, besides the, a healthy whole food plant-based diet, was we got them moving after every meal. So
Right.
after every meal, they were out walking. We had them doing an exercise class every day, mostly dancing, and they loved to dance. And it was just incredible what moving after eating did for their after meal blood glucose levels. So it was really quite an experience. I was there for 8 months the first time. And then I came back regularly afterwards. I was coming every couple of years. And one of the things that I was asked to do, I think it was 2017, was to create a nutrition education program for the schools and to train all the teachers in the schools how to implement this program. And so I had some just beautiful opportunities there. And I saw a change in what the restaurants were offering, what the grocery stores were offering, what people were cooking in their homes. And one of the highlights for me was teaching, teaching the teachers and making beans. And many of them had never even tasted beans. Beans weren't part of what they did. And being such an inexpensive source of protein, I just thought it would be perfect for them. And so teaching them and preparing a bean dish, using the fresh coconut that we, squeezed into coconut milk and with the beans. I can remember one lady, and they loved it. They were just eating it up. And one lady said, "These beans are just as good as ice cream." And I thought,
That's
we
funny.
have really made an impact if they think the beans are as good as ice cream. And so it was just such a positive experience. I really loved being there.
Well, that message, it can't be said enough. This idea that, we always talk about these healthy choices being able to prevent problems. People lose sight of the power of reversibility, how incredibly profound it is to see things that have been generating over so many years by applying some very powerful tools of support in even a very short time, you reverse these incredible changes. I've always likened it almost to this idea that there's almost like a biological process of forgiveness etched into the genetic machinery of the living system, this ability to have this kind of autonomy and expression of health. And all we need to do is provide some very simple requirements on a routine basis. And it's all about the food to a great extent. And we know that. So
I
that
absolutely love that sentiment. And I agree. I think the body just wants to heal. It wants to be healthy. And all we need to do is provide the raw materials so it can rebuild itself, because that's exactly what it does. When you think every single cell of the body is a product of what you put in your mouth,
Right.
it is remarkable how rapidly your body begins to heal and rebuild. And that is, I think, was the biggest shocker for me when I started working in the Marshall Islands. I just was so impressed by how quickly and how profoundly that transition occurs.
Right. Brenda, as we wind this down, do you have any final sentiments or words or ideas you'd like to share with the people out here?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first, I have to say thank you to the National Health Association for everything they do, the conferences, this podcast, just all of the wonderful work, their magazine or journal. It's just tremendous work, and they're making such a difference in the world. So I'm very grateful for that, and very grateful for you, Dr. Sabatino, for what you're doing and for the eloquent way that you frame these things in health. And I just wish everybody a wonderful, healthy, long life. And thank you for making better choices for yourself, for the animals, and for the planet. You're making a real difference in this world.
Well, I really want to thank my guest, Brenda Davis, today for sharing her information, her heart, her experience. And with all that knowledge and wisdom, she's just one of the nicest people I've ever met. I really want to thank you, Brenda, for being part of this. And I really want to thank our audience out there, because without you, we couldn't do what we do. And I want to really thank you for being part of this very healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. And I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Thank you. You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.